I think when you go through a breakup, you learn about your own strength and your own resilience. And I think you perhaps surprise yourself. I think we think that we can't possibly function or can't go on without that person that we had become so very attached to. But then we do, and perhaps we emerge even stronger. I mean, for that reason, the subtitle of my book is The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak.
Welcome to the Longest Day podcast. I'm Leah, your host and the founder of Broadstairs Consulting. We help rebuild relationships and facilitate effective dialogue. We are convinced that people matter and that conversations count, so we started The Longest Day, a series of conversations where we learn from the resilience, determination, and candor of our guests. As they look back on their longest days, our hope is that it will empower you to look forward. We hope their stories will be a part of shaping yours. Rosie Wilby is an award-winning comedian, author, speaker, and the creator of global hit podcast and book, The Breakup Monologues. She has appeared many times on BBC Radio 4 programmes, including Women's Hour, Loose Ends, Saturday Live, and Forethought, on TV programmes including Good Morning Britain, and at major festivals including Latitude and Glastonbury. Her first book, Is Monogamy Dead?, was shortlisted for the Diva Literary Awards in 2017. Longlisted for the Polari First Book Prize in 2018, and followed her TEDx talk of the same name. Her acclaimed trilogy of solo shows investigating the psychology of love began with The Science of Sex and ended with The Conscious Uncoupling, which toured to venues including London's South Bank Centre and was shortlisted for Funny Women Best Show. Nicknamed the lesbian Louis Theroux, Rosie loves to use humour to unpack difficult questions about modern life and spread awareness of more conscious ways of beginning, maintaining, and ending human relationships. She presents radio shows for the BBC, Virgin Radio, and Resonance FM, writes for publications including The Guardian, Sunday Times, Cosmo, Stylist, and New Statesman, and speaks about relationships, resilience, and reinvention at conferences and corporate events. It's an absolute delight to have Rosie on the podcast and to have had the privilege to record with her in her home. Rosie, thank you so much for coming on The Longest Day. I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar with your podcast, but perhaps you might like to tell us about your longest day.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast, and it's great to meet you. My longest day, well, it is related to the theme of the podcast that I do that you mentioned, which is all about breakups. And the longest day was many years ago now, back in 2011, right at the beginning of the year, just on the 3rd of January, I was dumped by email from my 5-year relationship. And it came as quite a shock to me, even though obviously now with many, many years of perspective, I can look back and understand all the problems all the challenges. Let's not say problems. Let's say all the challenges that we had in that relationship. And yeah, you get a different perspective about it. And of course, what it has meant is that I sort of tucked the email away for quite a few years and couldn't really deal with it because the breakup had been incredibly painful. But then a few years later, I ended up writing a trilogy of comedy shows all about the psychology of love, and then starting the podcast, The Breakup Monologues, writing 2 books about relationships. One's called Is Monogamy Dead? And one is the same title as the podcast. And talking, speaking, writing articles for many, many newspapers and publications, and doing lots of talks at science festivals, literary festivals, philosophy festivals, and thinking more broadly about our human connection and how we can try and do all of this stuff, all these different types of relationships, from romantic and sexual partnerships to friendships and work relationships, how we can do them all, how we can connect and then disconnect when we need to in more compassionate ways, and how we can communicate better. Because I realized that I hadn't been very good in the past at communicating my needs and boundaries and what I was about as a human being. And so it makes you think about how to get better at that, because of course, when you are suddenly dumped, you do feel like the floor has sort of disappeared from under you. You're a bit like a tree uprooted. That imagined future that you had and you clung on to so fiercely as a foundation of your own identity is suddenly not there anymore. And it's completely bewildering and you don't know where you're at. And people feel all kinds of incredible physical sensations, from their skin feeling like it's falling off to feeling like they're going to have a heart attack to not having any appetite to not being able to sleep. And it really does seem to be this really, really difficult process for people to grieve the loss of a relationship, and almost similar to the bereavement that we feel when somebody dies, because I guess something has died. And obviously there are differences with that type of grief, but there are so many common threads and similarities as well. And so I do often think of them a bit as sort of different strands of grief that kind of tangle together in confusing ways sometimes.
There's clearly a lot of fruit from your experience. But let's go back to your feelings in the moment that you received that email. What did you do after reading it?
Well, I think you start to compose a million different responses that you assume they were all going to change the person's mind and it's going to sort of save the day. And your immediate response is, well, no, this can't be right. You've got it wrong. You want to sort of fight, don't you? Your senses are all heightened. Your adrenaline is surging and you think, well, I can change this. I can make everything right. I've just got to remind her, well, what an amazing partnership we have. What's she talking about? And so, yes, I can remember taking some time over writing a reply, but not enough time to write a completely rational and reasoned reply. So we did have some kind of a dialogue. I mean, when I talk about the breakup in my comedy shows, I have sort of made it sound like she just, sent this missive and then that was that. It's never really as clean cut as that. But, I sort of joke that I felt much better once I'd corrected her spelling. But of course, humor can be this defense mechanism, can't it? Where we're not revealing the real truth of, the horrors of despair that you're feeling, and you're wondering how you're going to get through that day. So I think you do go into a sort of emergency coping strategy where you start contacting your friends and seeing who's around, because you don't know if you can sit with yourself and your own feelings. There was a female comedian I was meeting for lunch. She wasn't one of my close friends, but was a lovely person. And so I messaged her to kind of explain that I think she wanted to get some advice from me about some comedy stuff. And I was like, I don't know whether I'm really going to be that useful today because this has happened. And she was like, no, it'd be lovely to see you. And, we just had a nice chat, and I maybe helped her a bit with the stuff she was asking about. But, it was just nice to be with someone and in some company. But yeah, also was obviously messaging kind of close friends. One of my first ever exes is one of my kind of closest friends, and a particular go-to when relationships go wrong, because we've kind of been through all that stuff and got through the other side of it, and we became friends after a breakup. So I think we kind of understand one another in this really foundational way, because it was our first serious relationship. And also what I remember is that I had a gig that night that was booked, like an Edinburgh preview of one of my shows that was about love and relationships. And I rang the promoter, who was a lovely, lovely guy called Simon. And I was concerned that I was just not going to be in a fit state to do a gig and be funny and make people laugh. And he was very sweet. And he said, look, we could pull it. We sold a good number of tickets. It's a really lovely audience. They've come to see you. You know, it's not just like a comedy night where they're just drunk people who don't care who stands up in front of them. This was actually my show, and those people had booked for me. So it was likely there were some of my friends, followers, fans from South London, and people who genuinely wanted to see me. And Simon thought I could be very honest up front at the top of the show and make that a part of it. And so I suppose I started thinking about how that could be possible. And I talk about how this was one of my most magical shows ever. I don't really do as much pure stand-up now as I used to, because I do all this other sort of diverse kind of range of speaking and writing, taking in the more serious, reflective thoughts as well as the humour and the comedy. But within my stand-up career, that still remains one of my favourite ever performances, because I did have to sort of critique the show that I'd written live in the room on the spot and say, well, that joke, doesn't feel authentic anymore, and really process this stuff in the room with the audience, which felt very genuine in a way that comedy doesn't always, because often there's a certain amount of artifice to it. And you're sort of saying, a funny thing happened to me on the way here. And actually that funny thing happened 5 years previously. And you've told it many, many times, this well-honed anecdote, whereas this was completely fresh and raw. And I sort of say it was like my Tig Notaro moment, because obviously Tig had this incredible moment that was captured in an audio recording where she spoke very, very honestly and candidly about having cancer. And sometimes those very raw human moments can make for great comedy, because we all sort of want to laugh to cope with what's happening. And the fact that we've all been through breakups and they hurt like hell. So yeah, I think we were all feeling very together and very held by this idea of recovering and processing.
It's incredibly brave to take that raw story and trial it on a live audience. But humor as a defense mechanism can lessen pain. How long did it take from your longest day until you were giving the live show's content without feeling pain?
I think, it's an interesting one. And some of the philosophy conferences I've been involved with, there's a comedy and philosophy conference that has been happening at the University of Kent for the past few years. And there's a philosopher there called Lucy O'Brien, who has been investigating the idea of comedy as an art form and this peculiar cultural artifact, and whether in fact it's an act of self-harm, because it's a strange thing to do, right? As a comedian, to get up there and ask people to laugh at you, when it's sort of understood socially that somehow being laughed at is devaluing socially. And I think there's a really complex thing going on depending on who you are as a comedian, both in terms of whether you're a straight white young man, which the sort of default comedian is, and how far you sort of move away from that in terms of your identity. And I'm a, middle-aged queer woman. So I'm already a little bit away from that, but also in terms of whether people know you from the telly and that kind of profile aspect of it. You can do a lot more, and you can have a lot more agency in that position. Whereas I think I look back at my comedy career and I think, in addition to, and depending on how the compere has set things up as well, but sometimes in addition to getting the audience to laugh at some sort of social mishap, I slipped over when I was getting on the train, or, something slapsticky like that, I've also sometimes inadvertently been inviting audiences to laugh at my failure to be, in inverted commas, normal, because I'm gay, and because of some of the material I do about being a lesbian, which I always thought was celebratory and sort of trying to connect with the more sort of heteronormative audiences I tend to stand in front of. I think sometimes there's something uncomfortable there. And I know Hannah Gadsby has obviously touched on this a lot, on this idea of humility versus humiliation. And are you in some way getting the audience to laugh at who you are because it's different from who the majority of the audience are? And that there's a complex tension there, which I'm untangling now, but I think I haven't always completely understood. So to answer your question, I think for a long time there was still pain there in what I was excavating, and maybe I wasn't being kind to myself by continually exploring this story. And I think it's only, really quite a few years later when I had understood more what had happened around that particular breakup, which, because human beings aren't always good at communicating, and because there's a certain amount of shame when you've moved on and you met someone else and all of these kind of things that happen, there hadn't always been that great communication about what had happened at the end of that relationship. And I think sometimes it's only when you've got that understanding and that information that you do move on a bit further. But I think it's a very interesting process, using your own personal life as part of your art, because yes, it is on the one hand healing, but sometimes you've got to take a step back and look at what you're actually doing. There've been certain points when we've had really sort of high profile guests on the podcast and really exciting episodes where lots of people have listened. And I've then had a lot of people messaging me about their breakup and sort of, can I help them? And a lot of sort of reading a lot of traumatic and difficult stories. And obviously I have to tell people I'm not a professional relationship therapist, and to maybe try and give them some information and stuff. But I suppose you can start to set yourself up as someone who, can absorb all this information about people's really difficult experiences, which actually sometimes can be hard, can't it?
I mean, it's obviously an amazing privilege to be able to resonate with people in a way that gives them permission and confidence to share their own stories.
Of course, absolutely.
But one of the really challenging things about grief is that it is so complex, and especially where the loss feels less tangible. You said that you had friends around you and close friends around you. Did you ever solicit the advice of a relationship counselor or a trauma practitioner to support you as you were excavating your own experiences day in, day out?
Yes. Now, after the breakup, I did get into another relationship reasonably quickly, which is somebody that I am now friends with. And we kind of went through a much more conscious breakup when we eventually broke up. But it was actually when that relationship was ending that I was ready to really start processing everything that had happened over the past several years. And I did see a therapist for not even really a prolonged period of time, just, a fairly concentrated period of time, just to work through what was happening. But I think sometimes you seek refuge and you seek escape, and it's really classic, isn't it, to get into another relationship because you think that will somehow replace the old one. And you kind of know that, but then you can't quite get yourself out of that situation because you also start to feel responsible and not wanting to hurt another person. And there's a lot of complex stuff that we begin to feel. And so, yeah, it was difficult because, of course, you grow attached to the new person, even though you got into it too quickly. And yeah, when I eventually did have some therapy, I think it was just good to think about why that relationship, not just the breakup, but prior to the breakup, why it had been painful, and the fact that it had been a secret relationship, which I've also spoken about a lot as well, and how, that sort of reinforces feelings of shame and otherness. Because even though we now live in a world where I've been able to get married to my wife, and Obviously, LGBTQ equality has moved forward in so many ways. It's really not all that long ago that I was in a relationship with this woman who was not able to be out to her family, and they didn't accept who she was. So that's still a situation for many people. Even here, we're sitting talking in Margate, where obviously there's a huge queer community, but you wouldn't have to go very far probably to find people who were living in shame and fear.
Well-being. You know the facts. Things are worse than ever. Burnout, trauma, absence, attrition. Leaders are tired of the empty gesturing about mental health. Leaders are resigned to ticking boxes, obliged to throw money away on medically flimsy, temporary solutions that have failed workforces. Adagio VR is the culmination of decades of work by a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Partners of the NHS and Oxford University, this is the world's first ever virtual reality programme using clinical therapeutics accessible anywhere. Take meaningful action. Remove the need to cope. Adagio VR.
You mentioned that one of the things that you learned related to communication, but you also mentioned that you were tempted to take responsibility for things that weren't yours in the demise of the relationship. Now that you're looking back, what do you think was the greatest lesson that you learned about yourself?
I think when you go through a breakup, you learn about your own strength and your own resilience. And I think you perhaps surprise yourself. I think we think that we can't possibly function or can't go on without that person that we had become so very attached to. But then we do, and perhaps we emerge even stronger. I mean, for that reason, the subtitle of my book is The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak, because I've met so many people who have gone on to reinvent themselves, begin a new chapter, go on exciting adventures, begin that career that they'd always been dreaming of, but somehow hadn't given themselves permission to set about doing. New hobbies, new activities, traveling, new friendships, exciting new ways of going about being in the world, I suppose. And I think there's that possibility that I hadn't really been open to. You can become so fixed in who you think you are and where you think you want to live and who you want to live with. And I mean, I never thought you're sitting there actually cuddling my dog. And I always thought I was a cat person and was not into dogs at all. And now I have a dog and a cat, and you can be both. And who knew? I didn't even realize that. And I think having a dog has opened my life up in lots of wonderful ways that I just would have never thought possible. So I think we have to be more open to possibility, and we can become a bit closed down.
As you look back over the ways that the Breakup Monologues exploded and transformed your career and your reach, is there anything that you would do differently?
Yeah, well, I it's a really it's a difficult question, that, because I think talking about breakups is a complex topic, because there is a certain amount of responsibility in encouraging people to be revealing about something that has happened to them and has happened to somebody else as well. So we always try to talk about breakups in a way that is conscious and compassionate and isn't necessarily sort of blaming and pointing fingers at people. So I hope that we've always done that. But, maybe there's the odd moment where I think, I wonder what that other person's side of the story is. But you can't always reflect all sides. And I hope there's an understanding of the fact that there are different truths about a breakup story. And those truths are all true, even though they might be completely different. They're completely authentic stories to the people, to the individuals involved in what's happened. But we probably have completely different emotional journeys through what is going on.
Yeah, and phases of experience vary wildly depending on where you are in that grief cycle as well. So the same story told by the same person 6 months later could be markedly different.
That's true too, yes.
If you had to live your longest day again, what food would you choose to fuel it?
Ooh, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because the classic breakup food is all very kind of sugary, isn't it? Very sort of, we turn to chocolate and ice cream and sweet things because, scientists have told me that chocolate releases dopamine. So, it helps us replace some of those happy, high chemicals. I think I do really like some spicy foods. That gives me a bit of a lift. And so maybe rather than, I'm sure I did binge on chocolate. I'm certain that I would have reached for the chocolate shelf in the supermarket at that time. But maybe I would try and have some actual food as well, and maybe some spicy kind of food. Like I particularly love Thai soup, like tom yum soup. So maybe I would go for some lovely tom yum soup with some nice sort of fresh coriander on the top. So I just feel like sometimes that spice gives you a lift in a different way than maybe just all the sweet treats.
And the trend continues of not a single repeated food choice from the longest day guests. Rosie, it's been an absolute delight to have you. Thank you so much for sharing yourself, for sharing your story, for sharing your insights. And it's great to be here in Margate looking out over the sea with your wonderful dog. So thank you for giving us your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Broadstairs Consulting Limited podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2024, production copyright Broadstairs Consulting Limited, all rights reserved.